We also welcome the new work program on just transition pathways as an opportunity to create an enabling policy environment to drive and accelerate the systemic change that this requires, but without losing sight of the equity considerations. Since just transitions are inherently embedded in local contexts, international negotiations must connect to the lived realities of the people whose lives will be most impacted by climate policy. Our researchers have embedded themselves in hundreds of these interconnected stories, from waste pickers in Nairobi affected by changing waste management policies to communities in Indonesia grappling with the impacts of coal mine closures, smallholder farmers in Malawi navigating new agricultural adaptation policies, and India's MSMEs struggling to leverage finance for low-carbon transitions amidst a very informal nature in their sectors. This is a moment for transformation, and unless we can ground international negotiations like the work program on just transitions into local realities, UNFCCC spaces and international climate agreements may fail to deliver the betterment of the world that we demand to see. Therefore, we are delighted to be hosting this important event today. In our role as neutral conveners, we really like to bring to the table multiple and diverse perspectives, as you will see from our lineup of amazing speakers and panelists today. We will begin by hearing from 3 acclaimed presenters on the policy, science, and finance aspects of just transitions from an international perspective. Later, we will hear from esteemed actors representing local and diverse perspectives on just transitions, including national policymakers, youth representatives, indigenous leaders, and non-profit organizations. Taken together, we hope that these conversations can provide us with a better insight on the gaps and overlaps between these two levels of the just transition. I kindly ask our speakers to please stick to your allotted times because we have a very packed agenda and we really want to hear from all these interesting perspectives. And I would like to close just by saying that we look forward to hearing from your stories, whether they come from research, from policy examples, or from personal experiences, as we search for ways to support ambitious, equitable, and collaborative just transitions. Without further ado, I would like to invite to the stage Mrs. Susana Muhammad, Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia. Oh, yeah, you're here, sorry. I haven't seen you. I was just confirming that you are here with us to deliver our opening speech. Mrs. Muhammad is a recognized environmentalist, politician, and political scientist from Palestinian descent. Her work focuses on consolidating Colombia as a world power for life through compliance with international agreements on climate change and biodiversity laws, the protection of environmental defenders, and the fight against the deforestation in the Amazon arc. Welcome, Mrs. Muhammad. Please join me on the podium.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for this invitation. I would like to check how much time I have. 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. We are here almost at the end of this negotiation, but always the end seems like the beginning, actually. And we are reflecting deeply on what it means to have these just transitions. This introduction will try to address some of the key elements that we see are already within the narratives and the discourse of the mainstream institutional and international cooperation agendas, but which are the elements that are really not allowing for the transition in the time of the science. Firstly, I have to say that Colombia's position is to be as close to the science as possible. We take climate change seriously. We believe in the Colombian government, and this has been developed as a national law in Congress, our NDCs, that climate change is a reality and is anthropogenically created. And thus that it requires a shift, not only in a technological transition, but it requires a change in different systems that will help or not this transition. Within this process of development, and I mean development as the process of industrialization, fossil fuels have been at the heart of the way we live today, and has created a geopolitical landscape where the capacity to produce, export, and consume oil, what President Petro calls the fossil capital, is correlated to the economic power and political power of nations. If this is the correlation that fossil capital allows the components of what a modern society calls develop, and that this fossil capital is also a wealth of power, then the question, if we need to move beyond gas, oil, and fossil fuels, is what will be the new world configuration and what will be the opportunities, challenges, and inequalities within the system that will help us or not make that shift. And we can see that in the current negotiations. On the one hand, we make visible from the panel of experts the energy transition. So it seems to be a consensus that we need to triple renewables, and that this will be, according to the UN reports and the IPCC, something that is valuable and that nobody objects. It seems to be that we have more or less reached a consensus that we can be more energy efficient, and that we can double energy efficiency. It seems to be also that we can talk about methane and other gas related to climate change that could help us. But when we address the need to phase out fossil fuels, production, and consumption, that's where we get the difficulties in political terms. And why is that? Because it will change the configuration of current power. Let's examine the first measure. Let's triple the renewables. The first question I would put is under what conditions? If we say let's triple renewables, it means investments that will put a lot of the capital up front, and then that they're more expensive. You put the capital up front, and then the payment of that capital will come after, as you make the savings of a less costly or almost zero cost operation. But then the question is who has the capital and who has the access to the capital. So while in developing countries, the access to capital is at 30%, in developed countries it's at 5% or less. While developing countries are 30 of them about to default their debt, and many of us as Colombia, which are middle-income countries but highly indebted, do not have the opportunity to get further debt, but also have difficulty in accessing capital, then who's going to make this tripling of renewables? And at the end, which industry and which new power structure are we building? We want to bring this up the question of equality and the use of the fossil fuel transition to create a most just and overcome still the colonial structure that we have in the economic system. And this is critical because our countries are the ones that have the minerals for the transition, are the ones that have the labor for the transition, and are the ones that can have the biodiversity for this transition. So we have to use this opportunity to create not only an energy transition, but an economic transition that creates higher equality and more resilience in the world. The end is to create a safe world for us. The 1.5 is not a goal, it's an environmental limit. And it's an environmental limit which is already a disaster, and where actually the countries that have not created the problem will be dealing with the higher and worse consequences, especially countries in the tropical areas such as Colombia. So these negotiations are not only about ambition in terms of achieving the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Deep inside, they require a new structuring of the financial system, a new logic in the economic system, and also a new configuration of power if we want to actually create a more safe, under environmental limits, just, and also equitable world in an era where we will not be having, as the time before of the fossil capital, unlimited natural resources. We will come now to the stress of scarcity of the planet. Thinking about all of these aspects of the transition is important. Voicing all these aspects of this transition is important. This cannot become another round of export of raw materials from the south for creating technology in the north and re-importing, because not only now at stake, it is an economic balance and equality in the human world. What is at stake is actually the capacity of life to reproduce in the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Muhammad. And certainly the eyes of the world are now on Colombia, and I congratulate you and your delegation for the bold climate leadership that you have demonstrated, not only in the energy transition, but also in the context of just transitions. I am now honored to welcome to the stage our keynote speaker, Professor Jim Skea, current chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, for its 7th assessment cycle. Professor Skea has nearly 40 years of climate science experience and expertise, particularly on the topics of energy, climate change, and technological innovation. Among his various hats, he has been Professor of Sustainable Energy at Imperial College London, and from 2018 to 2023, he chaired the Scotland's Just Transition Commission. Professor Skea, thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much. And as you said in the introduction, although I may represent IPCC in science, until a few weeks ago I was also chair of a Just Transition Commission, which was definitely not a scientific job because it involved getting coordination and consensus among trade unions, businesses, and environmental groups. And I may say our job was entirely to be policy prescriptive and tell ministers what they should be doing, which is why I needed to step down with my policy neutral IPCC role. But just to say, doing these two things at the same time has given me opportunity to reflect on the very subject, I think, of this meeting, the connection between global and perhaps more scholarly perspectives and the reality actually on the ground. And let me say, just right from the start, I think there is a gap in terms of the actionability of a lot of the research that's being carried out, and I think I would make that a theme. Now, in terms of IPCC and how just transition was addressed in the last cycle, which has just ended, we actually scoped the cycle in the middle of the 2017, just before the Katowice COP, which really put just transition on the map. And so there was no formal way of introducing just transition into the reports until the synthesis report was scoped, which did include the concept of just transition. And I should say Working Group 3 smuggled just transition in all sorts of ways to help form the synthesis report. And just transition was considered through the lens of equity, sustainable development more broadly, and principles of justice. So just to say how it was actually treated in the last report, Working Group 3 had an overview box on just transition. And I'll just read the first two sentences from that box because it kind of sets the tone. So, the Just Transition framework refers to a set of principles, processes and practices aimed at ensuring that no people, workers, places, sectors, countries or regions are left behind in the move from a high carbon to a low carbon economy. It includes respect and dignity for vulnerable groups, creation of decent jobs, social protection, employment rights, fairness in energy access and use, and social dialogue and democratic consultation with relevant stakeholders. And that was a distillation of lots of what I might call the more theoretical literature that was out there on just transition. So if we look at what the report actually covered, and it was Working Group 3 on mitigation that really covered this, there was a lot of material on the principles of just transition, starting with the International Labour Organization kind of conceptualization. There was a review of what just transition activities were underway across the globe both nationally and subnationally, and I should emphasise that a lot of just transition activities have actually been subnational. And there was a lot of work on what I will crudely and unscientifically call job counting. How many jobs are lost when you move out of high carbon sectors? How many jobs are created when you actually move into other sectors? Now, what I would say from my personal experience in being involved in a Just Transition Commission that was concerned with delivery on the ground, I'm going to give you a bit of a shopping list of things that we would have wanted to know more about in order to inform our activities. So I think part of the agenda, and this is for the scientific community as much as IPCC, because IPCC assesses what the scientific community does. We need to continue with an assessment of what actually works in terms of delivering just transition actually on the ground. That is important. That's started. We need to continue with that. I referred to the crude concept of job counting. I do think we need to pay attention to job quality as well as job counting. It is our observation that for people who were leaving employment in high carbon sectors and taking up employment, say, in renewables, frankly, the jobs were less well paid than they were in the sectors in which they were leaving. So the question of whether, similar levels of skills are being rewarded in different ways is important. I think it's important that we do work on skills mapping to actually understand specifically what kind of activities can be moved over from one sector to another. And where I come from, there's a lot of offshore activity. So frankly, offshore skills can be applied both for oil and gas and for offshore renewables. So things like, for example, the diving, for example, in offshore is important. It matters both in the high carbon economy and the low carbon economy. And I may say the diving jobs are less well paid on offshore renewables projects than they are, for example, offshore oil and gas. I think another question around there, so this is a bit of a shopping list, the question of timing and dynamics. One of the observations we had is that the jobs in the old sectors could potentially disappear before the jobs in the new sectors could emerge. So there's a question of the timing and how you handle the transition and what it means in a very practical way for workers and communities that are affected. Now, one of the things we were challenged in the Scottish Just Transition, because one of our challenges was to act as critical friends to government and appraise the progress they were making. We were really concerned about developing indicators and metrics for just transition. And just to say that the transition bit is easy, that is much more or less carbon dioxide equivalent. What we were looking for was indicators about the justice element of just transition, which I think is a far bigger challenge and is sort of opening up new areas. And if I can just pick up on the things that the Minister from Colombia was saying, there are big challenges about transitioning into new sectors as well as transitioning out of old sectors. And I'm particularly conscious there about labour rights and human rights along emerging supply chains that I think is a consideration that we really need to bring in there, because there are new provinces, new regions becoming involved in the low carbon economy. I might say one that we also picked up on was the relation between just transition and trade rules, for example. We had the issue that in many cases we found that there was a lot of import of products and skills from different parts of the world. And there was a lot of concern among the trade unions about establishing local content conditions on new contracts, for example, for renewables energy, for which there was, frankly, a tension between both European Union rules and World Trade Organization rules. And this question of local content, which is perceived to be an important part of just transition, is one that need managed. And I think that touches on to the Colombian challenge about making sure that it is not just the export of raw materials, it's actually capturing the more value-added activities so that it contributes to wider economic development. And I think the final point I would make is it's often been implied to energy and mitigation, but just to say it goes, I think, beyond energy and it goes beyond labour markets. We have also been concerned about the demand side and the consumption side of the economy, and whether concepts can also be taken over into agriculture and land use as well as the energy sector, where any issues like land rights actually arise. And just another thought, many just transition principles could also be applied to adaptation as well as mitigation, where I think there are inequalities perhaps in terms of impacts. And just a very final point, that was a bit of a long shopping list of ideas. So let me just end with one thought. It does worry me sometimes that the phrase just transition is sprinkled onto the things we need to do as a kind of magic dust to make it easy and simple. It is not easy and it's not simple, and we need to work hard at it to ensure that there is a genuinely just transition as we move to a low carbon world. And I'll finish there.
Thank you, Professor Skea, and how fascinating. You reminded me actually of an event I attended last week when one of the participants said that in the clean, just transition, the clean is driven by science and the just is driven by equity. And I really appreciate that your speech can help us reconcile that actually science and justice and equity are part of the same equation. So thank you for that. And I would like to now bring to the stage our final speaker in this round, Dr. Heiner von Lübke, Senior Researcher at DIW Berlin, to shine a light on a very critical question. How can we improve climate finance to simultaneously support local just transitions and international climate goals? Heiner is one of our lead research partners in the SNAPFI project, which explores how international climate finance can enable transformative change through domestic policies in developing countries. Prior to DIW, he also worked for the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, for GIZ, and as an advisor to the German government. Thank you very much for joining us today, Heiner.
Moving a little bit closer to the audience now. So, as Adriana was saying in the introduction, the key question...
Sorry, Heiner, I think you need to maybe speak louder or a little bit closer to the microphone.
Is this better now? I think... Good. Yes, so... as Adriana pointed out in the introduction, the question is whether two communities, the international climate finance community and communities related to local just transitions, are moving closer in their collaboration. So to address this question, I'll give you a little bit of background why, what the qualities are and the characteristics of these two types of actors, the international climate finance and those related to locally led just transitions, by highlighting, and that's the second part of the presentation, cases of international climate finance that was used for transitions in land use and energy in Brazil, Indonesia, and South Africa. Conclusions and recommendations will follow at last. But before I go into the substance, I would like to appreciate the joint work that we have done together with colleagues from South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia, and India. And this project is coming to an end. What I'm presenting here is more related to the work of DIW, so I'm not speaking on behalf, but this is a joint collaborated effort that I'm showing. Are these really two worlds, climate finance and just transitions? So these two actor groups, international climate finance actors and local actor groups, presumably have own worldviews, strategies, and objectives. So funders typically focus on climate primarily, but also development. Think of the term climate finance. And I picked up this kind of like more harder legal requirement. They are accountable to national audit bodies. So they are bound to these regulations back home, so they cannot do everything that they would wish to do. So while local actors, of course, a very diverse group, political actors deciding on the direction of the transition, the social justice dimension, inclusion, as well as, of course, the citizens making decisions in everyday life. So in this kind of situation, how can we ensure that climate finance is delivered in a way that supports just transitions as well as international climate goals? I picked out the Just Energy Transition Partnership, well-known, South Africa in the power sector, the multi-donor funding amounting to $8.5 billion US. And I contrasted that with the case of land use and deforestation, where Brazil and Indonesia work with a range of bilateral donor agencies. And we did local interviews with those funders working in the countries and local actors about what they perceive are mutual perceptions, roles and factors for successful cooperation. Let's look into the JET-P of South Africa first. The first thing that becomes noticeable is that there are two levels here. So the first one is the international agreement level. Think back of COP26, the meeting of President Ramaphosa and the funders, where it was decided to have this energy transition, and then you have the domestic transition process, and that's where we're looking into a little bit more detail. So on this picture here in the lower part, you can see different coalitions struggling around, let's say, questions: what is the political direction for the transition, about the speed and the characteristics of phasing in renewables, phasing out fossil fuels, etc. So that's important to recognize that there are different coalitions, is not as clear-cut as it may seem from the outside. So the international actors, they are actually part of this process. They're playing a little bit of a special role, of course, but they are associated with the pro-transition coalition. Let's reflect a little bit about the number one principle of international cooperation, that is that this has to have ownership of countries. But in such situations where you have struggling coalitions, who holds exactly the ownership? I think that's an important question, because international actors engaging with a pro-transition coalition, but naturally owing to the objectives that they have, not with the actors slowing progress. The follow-up question arising from that is that, are they legitimized to play a role in the domestic policy process? I think that needs to be clarified in open dialogues. We have also some other findings that I'm showing you here. Trust should be improved, and I think the theme here is show, don't tell. On both sides, show the finance and show some actions to build on, give funders something to work, and vice versa. Type of funding. Grant funding falling a little bit short in the case of South Africa's JET-P is indispensable in early stages of transition, because that allows to work flexibly, allows to work in uncertain environments, and it's possible to fund policy advocacy work to strengthen the pro-transition groups. The justice components needs more definition and workable finance instruments and modalities. And one thing that is going at the very heart of cooperation, maybe nothing new, but here it seems to be a little bit that mutuality is an element of cooperation. So currently it's more like a unidirectional channeling of support. But what about the coherence with funders' domestic policies and processes and measures? Are South African partners then also entitled to give an opinion and comment about the progress of funders' policy progress? Let's look into deforestation and land use in Brazil and Indonesia. Both countries have zero deforestation targets to be achieved by 2030. And if you look at one level below these ambitious targets, you look into the policy mix of instruments, what are the terms of implementation, and that's very much contested. So there is ambiguity about the choice of instruments and how to implement this, which direction should be more neoliberal, should it be more strict. And so in this kind of environment, the bilateral cooperation projects work with the executive branch of the ministry, such as the Ministry of Environment and Forests in Indonesia. That way, international actors are becoming part of the policy process by contributing to solutions through policy proposals and capacity building. But what are some of the challenges? We find that political battle is taking place in something that I would call hard-to-reach spheres. That's, for example, the organized agribusiness in Brazil lobbying for weak implementation of the forest law, or in the sphere of political economy of land use in Indonesia when it's about commodities, mining, investment in infrastructure, which is typically for strategic reasons shielded from external influences. Again, what came up in this case also is the mutuality of cooperation. If funders help achieving our NDCs, do they achieve their own? That was something that we heard quite often mentioned. The conclusions and recommendations I would like to give is that first, an affirmation. I'm pointing this out because research sometimes has the tendency to look into something that is critical, that's something that needs to be improved, and the gaps, etc. But finance is indeed needed, of course. Global visibility of such cooperation can also show the relevance to local decision makers of such transitions. There is a need for sensitivity and openness to discuss challenges and feedback them to decision-making level. I mentioned the role of trust and what about the rules of the game when we think about the international local cooperation in domestic just transition processes. The type of finance grants need to be scaled up because they're important in early transitions. And what about the role of international actors in domestic policy processes? Okay or not? My last slide here is maybe not a surprise to all of you who are attending the conference here, but local development and climate should be balanced in international support for just transitions. I'm saying that because in the political reality, national politicians' survival depend on delivering on local development priorities and objectives, then on global goals. So if the emphasis is very much on global goals, then the question is like, is that a hard sell or an easy sell back home? Introduce mutuality of cooperation is another element. Suggestion would be to include or consider the funders' policy progress into the cooperation with something that could be, for example, mutual policy peer reviews. So to put it on more equal footing, the cooperation, and also paying respect to the nature of climate cooperation as a whole, which means that we are all in this together. With this, I would like to thank and close and open floor.
Thank you very much, Heiner. Thank you very much for also addressing one of the key topics that we have been hearing of in every single negotiation room, which are the means of implementation of finance. Heiner, if you don't mind, can you please stay in the table? And I would actually like to welcome back to the stage Professor Skea. Unfortunately, Mrs. Mohammed was not able to stay for the panel discussion, but that's scope. It happens. You know how quickly agendas change. So I have many questions that I would like to ask our panelists, but in the interest of time, I would actually like to open the floor directly to questions from the audience. We have around 15 to maybe 20 minutes for Q&A. We may also have some questions online. If we have people joining us from their homes, you can also send the questions to the chat in the COP platform. So if you don't mind, if you want to address one of the speakers, can you please raise your hand, say your name, affiliation, and who you are addressing this question to? We may be able to collect maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then I'll get the panel to reply. Yes, I have one here. Okay, I think we'll start with yours, and then we will get the ball rolling.
Hi, thank you for the very insightful conversation. Joachim from the World Benchmarking Alliance. So I was really interested to hear more about the indicator side Mr. Jimsky mentioned. There seems to be developments also in other jurisdictions, in New Zealand and in other countries as well. So I guess my question is, in the case of Scotland and other countries, are there more discussions about the role that these indicators can play in seeing if the transition is not unfolding as it should? How can the indicators inform so that the transition can be more just? Or how does it weave more into the policy planning and the processes needed to deliver a just transition?
Yeah. Okay, if I can answer it directly, and I'm afraid I don't really have a good answer on that because we failed to deal with it properly, on my commission, just before I stepped down. But I mean, just to say, I mean, you can think of the areas in which indicators are needed, which includes labour markets, training, skills issues. If we're looking at labour market issues, I think one of the challenges we faced is that governments often use quite high standards for statistical indicators, kind of gold standards, and many of the indicators we would perhaps have looked for were not immediately available. So one of the things we were very keen to do was to do a kind of trawling exercise to see what relevant indicators were being produced by business organisations, by trade unions that might not come directly from government. Frankly, we're performing a big experiment on the planet. I think we can be a bit more experimental with our statistics, if I can put it that way as well.
Thank you. Heiner, would you like to also refer to the question, or?
I actually have not much insights into the Scottish situation. So.
No problem. Okay. Anyone else would like to raise a question to the panel? Okay, perfect. I see one hand here. Okay, let's go with your question then. Here, the person. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, thank you both. It was really interesting. I'm Maria from the Lebanese delegation. I guess my question is more to Dr. Heiner, but if you would have anything to add, it would be great. So my question is, so you talked a lot about the involvement of international actors in local projects. And my question is how to mitigate the risks of this involvement into not, in a way, like taking over the direction, because we were saying that like in some situations the international actors come because the policy directions are not going in ways that seem to be fulfilling the objectives of the project in the first place, I guess. So how to mitigate the potential risks of having too much involvement from international actors and redirecting projects that do not fit national agendas or priorities, I guess.
It's a very good question. I'd like to answer that by looking back a little bit into the history of international cooperation. You had this infamous instrument of conditionality that funders applied, meaning the conditions was that something needs to be achieved on the recipient side. Question raised, is this in the best interest of the recipient? Is that the right thing to do? And so I think in that context that we're looking into here, funding for international funding for just transitions, this doesn't really apply anymore. So I think that the sensitive issues that I found in the research, I think they need to be discussed in an open dialogue and ways to think about how to make this more mutual, meaning it's not only the focus on the recipient side policy framework or the transition process, but also it could be the other way around, so to make that more balanced.
I can see one hand over there. If we can get the microphone to Andrea, and then the lady with the sunglasses on the head.
Thank you very much. Andrea Carmen, International Indian Treaty Council, Indigenous Peoples Constituency here as well. I will talk a little bit about this from my perspective when I speak in a bit, but I'd like to ask you for your perspectives on how do you define just? What are the criteria, and why are we even using that word in this context? So what does just mean, in your opinion?
Thank you. Can we also give the microphone to the person behind that wanted to ask a question? Okay. And then we can reply to both. Okay.
Hi, I'm Lindsay. I'm a master's student at the University of Vermont, and I'm also here with an organization called Twin Transboundary Water and Cooperation Network. My question is about just transition in terms of like migration and cultural diplomacy efforts, and I'm wondering what role do you think that mediation plays in just transition?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Maybe on the question is what does just mean? I just say I think there's a lot of path dependency in terms of the use of these terms, and it very much comes from the environmental justice movement in the United States. And just to flag, it's very interesting that a lot of the literature, the scientific literature that is looked at in IPCC, does give a lot of consideration to the question of what more theoretically justice is and how it could be defined. I might say when we started the Scottish Just Transition Commission, we didn't stop for a nanosecond to think about what justice actually meant. We felt instinctively there was a way of moving forward and frankly just got on with it because we had a firm understanding that there was a big transition actually needed, and frankly it was about the social and economic consequences of that decision making round the transition, to which just the principles of justice could be applied. So it's certainly important that in the academic community we still give consideration to what we actually mean by justice in the context of a just transition. But I feel that in many practical initiatives the train has actually already left the station. But I don't know, you may be more academic about this than me.
I wished I was. But I'd like to add a little bit of a nuance here to the term just transition. And that is, I think that the discourse around just transitions is going beyond, let's say, what the focus was very much in the beginning on labor markets or job situations. I think it look at land use transitions. And it's very much about income, livelihoods of smallholders, small agriculturists. Will they still have a place and income to live by what they cultivate? What about justice in that kind of context, large agribusinesses versus smallholders? How will you deal with the involvement and the role of these people and their worlds in the just transition? Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we have one more question here. Do we have any questions online? Okay, perfect. Well, let's take this one here.
Yeah, thank you very much for your enlightening presentations. I just wanted to find out from Professor, in respect to the indicators that was, or you want to initiate or has been already put in place. Did you do anything on methodologies and funding? Would it be an indicator in respect to the just transition? Thank you.
Yeah, and just to say, I mean, sorry, I feel quite schizophrenic about this because I'm both an IPCC person and a kind of a practical one. It might be surprising, but when, in the practical activities, we spent 2 years and we scarcely mentioned funding at all, because most of the issues were around how you conducted business with each other, how you constructed consensus and build the kind of trust that has been talked about. That being said, funding cannot be left behind, and specifically in issues like the South African JET-P and the other JET-Ps we've done, funding is absolutely critical. And in fact, where I was in Scotland, the government did come up with a Just Transition Fund, which was deliberately intended to promote the development, economic diversification in the areas that were being affected by the rundown of the oil and gas industry. So money is incredibly important. Let's not forget that. Everybody cares about money, but it's also how you conduct your business is also, I think, equally vital.
Okay, any more questions from the audience? Okay, I'm going to jump in then because I do have one that I thought even before coming to COP, about a week before coming to COP, I turned on my TV and suddenly CNN came up and they were talking about our research conducted by the Pew Research Center, where they were basically highlighting that the anti-scientific sentiment has been growing in the United States from 17% to 27% in the last 4 years. That means that people, at least in the United States, and I would like to have the data for other countries, think that more and more that scientists are not really acting on the interest of the public. And I think that this is actually very dangerous from my perspective as climate strategists, as we really try to support everything we do with science and evidence. And I was wondering, from your perspective, Professor Skea, but also Heiner, since you also come from an academic background, how can we turn this around and really talk to the people about science in a language that can bring them back to our same mission to support the just transitions?
Since I have to go, maybe if I can start to address that. I mean, 2023 has been a very strange year in the sense that we've seen climate extremes. We have seen things happening on our television screens and in our direct experience that were previously predicted to happen in the future. So we have messages very obviously coming around that are saying, just emphasizing the urgency of the situation we're in. And yet we have almost a resurgence of some climate skepticism that's been taking place at the same time. And I don't think there's any magic solution for science to deal with that. We just need to keep plugging away and making the rational arguments, pointing out the evidence that is staring us in the face. So I don't think there's any magic bullet solution for science to do that, but we need to make sure that we raise our heads above the parapet and that we speak clearly and just set out the manifest evidence that there is in front of us.
Would like that?
Very briefly adding to this, I think one way is to establish relevance and show the importance of science, and I think that can be done by crossing over from the scientific community to the policy community or to the public and making efforts such as Professor Skea from the committee back into research and vice versa. And I think that also is good for science because it helps communicate messages, helps engagement with policy actors and public actors.
Thank you both. We are doing surprisingly well with our agenda. That never happens, so I'm very, very happy about it. We have maybe just a couple more minutes in case we have any remaining questions. Okay. Otherwise, I'm happy to move on then to our next panel, and I just want to thank again Professor Skea and Dr. Von Lucke for joining us today for such an insightful conversation. Please join me in thanking them. Thank you. Okay. I will now move on to our second panel discussion, and I would like to invite all our panelists to please come and join us on stage. While the panel is getting up to the stage, this panel will dive more deeply into what just transition mean at local level. Sorry. Can I have all the panelists please come to the stage? Sorry. Thank you. For this one, since it is a long one, I think I will join you on the table as well. As I was saying, this panel really want to take a deep dive into what just transitions mean at local level from a diversity of perspectives, and also how we can connect those perspectives to the conversation that we just heard from the first speakers. And for that, I will briefly tell you who we have on the panel today, and then we can just dive right in. First of all, we have Angelina Mensah from Ghana's Environmental Protection Agency. She is also national expert and national negotiator on response measures, gender and climate change in just transitions, and a member of the Katowice Committee of Experts on the impacts of the implementation of response measures. Then we have Andrea Carmen from the Yaqui Indigenous Nation in the United States and Executive Director of the International Indian Treaty Council. Next we have Leia Sehib, Youth Negotiator on behalf of Lebanon for the Work Program on Just Transitions and Project Coordinator at the Climate Change Unit of the Ministry of Environment. We have Olka Kelkar, Chair of the UN-backed Race to Zero Working Group on Fair Share, Equity and Justice, and Executive Director of Climate at WRI India. Finally, we have Dean Bekumusi Bebe, Campaigns Lead at PowerShift Africa. We will start with short 3-minute interventions from each one of our panelists, and then we will jump into a Q&A as we did with the previous panel. So let's start with maybe Angelina. And I am particularly interested in the work that you have been doing on gender and how to take into consideration gender within the UNFCCC and the NDCs. But please feel free to give us your perspective.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Yes, indeed, I've worked on gender, but in this current dispensation, I would like to speak on response measures and the just transition. You spoke about our understanding of what just transition is all about. In the perspective from Ghana, I think that a just transition should establish government trust, should take care of displaced workers and stranded assets. I should be able to curb massive labor disruptions. I mean, this should be a whole society approach. And this society approach is decarbonizing the planet. And I think that our focus has been mainly, not Ghana, but generally the global world is looking at the energy transitions. And I think that there are critical areas that transitions also have to look at. We just heard about the land transition. We have to look at the agriculture sector. We need to look at the biodiversity, the critical minerals, technology, and even finance in the transitions. And this is what Ghana seeks to do, and this is our interpretation of what just transition should be looking at. It should also be made in such a way that there's no polarization in the political arena. So in short, this is what I would offer as our just transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelina. Really good points that you were raising there. And I will now like to move on to Leia. Leia, when we were talking earlier, you really commented about the important role that youth-led initiatives are playing in transforming the climate landscape in Lebanon. So if you can please tell us a little bit more about that from your perspective.
Yes, thank you. First of all, it's a really interesting panel. It's nice to meet everyone. And I would actually like to focus a little bit on a couple of things that were said and pick up on it. Maybe start with the title, which is Connecting International Cooperation to Local Realities on Just Transition. So one of the biggest challenges that we have from a capacity building perspective is when you take all of these decisions that are made at the COP level and then translate that to the national level, and then how do you implement that on the local level? And one of the things that we've noticed is that, for example, for the energy sector, right, you have targets, you have NDCs you're trying to reach, and you do policy at the national level to try to get closer to those targets. But what we've noticed in recent years is that there's a lot of youth startups that work on renewable energy, that work on implementing solar power in different areas, different municipalities, and that's not represented at the national level. So we find ourselves getting closer to reaching our NDCs without being unknowingly closer to reaching our NDCs, without even comprehending the scale of the work that's being done by young individuals at a very local level. So that's something that we're trying to tap into more in Lebanon. And I actually wanted to touch on what Heiner said regarding the funding, because yesterday actually we released a new, Lebanon launched a new fund for developing or for mitigation action, kind of, which focuses a lot on linking international funding at the local level and allowing startups to tap into international funding without having to go through the government route, which in some developing countries' cases, the government route is a bit tricky and not the most successful way to get things done, let's say. So that is another thing also that we're tapping into. Thank you.
Thank you, Leia. I also remembered that during our previous conversation, you mentioned that young people can really bring in this rebellious mentality to drive change. And I think we can use a little bit of that here at COP, if not a lot of that as well.
Yes, true.
I will now pass over to Olka. Olka, please tell us more about your experience in the context of communities in India and also from your perspective in the Race to Zero campaign.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here and listen to everyone. I want to talk about three things today. One is that just transition is about all sectors that you can think of, and I'll give you some examples from some of the sectors in India. The second is that it's about not just phasing out fossil fuels, but also phasing in clean energy in a responsible way. And the third is that it's about looking at many different sources of finance. So let me just give you some examples of these. In terms of all sectors, we're looking at micro, small, and medium enterprises in the auto industry. We're looking at the building sector. We're looking at the transportation sector. And in all of these, we know that there are jobs that will be lost as certain segments of the value chain become redundant. And there'll be a need to reskill these workers and reaccommodate them in other parts of the value chain. And this will mean paying special attention to the fact that in these micro, small, and medium enterprises, the nature of the business is highly informal. So you don't even know who is the employer, who is the contractor, who's responsible for worker welfare or for reskilling them. And even in the more organized jobs, people may be very worried that as they reskill their workers, they'll actually lose them to their competitors. Women may not be able to access these skilling programs. So there is a real need to deal with this informality and deal with the root causes of women, for example, not having adequate science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. But there are positive examples. For example, there are states in India, subnational governments, that are building in these aspects into their tenders for electric buses or for clean electricity targets. And they're making sure that there are targets that are specified for training of women on, say, driving solid waste collection vehicles, on becoming electricians, on being EV bus drivers. And that is something that we need to have more on, building in targets and tenders for the social aspect, not just for the technology shift or the fuel shift. The second part I want to talk about is the phasing in of renewable energy, and there were references made to land. So as you have large, clean solar parks, our research has shown that there are issues of distributional justice, because we find that those who are losing their land and losing their agricultural and pastoral livelihoods are not getting adequately accommodated in terms of the new jobs on the solar park. There may be a few contractual jobs, say for security or for maintenance or for, say, cutting the grass, but not enough in terms of full-time equivalent jobs for the solar park. There are issues of representational justice. Who decides when negotiations are done on the leasing of the land or the rate at which the land is leased? And there are issues of restorative justice. For example, when pastoralists lose their access to their grazing lands, can you find them some other kinds of access? Can you have agri-photovoltaics so that there is coexistence of both the solar as well as of the agriculture or pastoralism? So all of the issues of justice that you brought up, how do you define it? Distribution in terms of jobs, losses and gains, representation in terms of how decisions are made, and restorative in the sense that if there is a loss of livelihoods, how do you reaccommodate them? And my final point is about finance. And we have research which looks at the macroeconomic fiscal implications of the low carbon transition. We find that a quarter at least of the Indian government's tax revenue currently comes from taxes on fossil fuels. And as you shift away from petrol and diesel and move towards, say, electric mobility, this tax revenue will be lost. Something like $100 billion will be lost in 2050 compared to the business as usual. That means for all of the things that we're talking about, skilling, safety nets, safe accommodation and transport for women, there will need to be alternative ways of providing this developmental and social actions. That means businesses, philanthropies, development agencies will all have to come together and address the just parts of the just transition, not just the investment needed for the new green technologies, but also for all of these social actions. And I want to end by referring to the working group that I chair, the Race to Zero Working Group on Fair Share, Equity and Justice. And it's a very tangible, very concrete opportunity for sharing guidance or best practices on how your business, your bank, your insurance company, your state or city can actually bring in aspects of how communities and workers are impacted by the way you achieve your net zero targets. I think we'd welcome the opportunity to share some of these experiences and build in tangible checklists or guidances that more organizations can follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elka. Very interesting. And I think you may be one of those unique but also very important people who play the role of connectors between the two levels, and I think most of you here are as well, but I think you just, in your intervention, it was quite clear, so thank you for that. I will now like to move over to Andrea. Andrea, if you can tell us from your perspective and the perspective of indigenous communities, how do we connect the two worlds?
Thank you, Chokwe Utesia, and thank you to the organizers of this important event. When we came into this discussion for the first time in Bonn at the SEBSTA, the first working group of the states, we stated in the meeting that if transition and just transition meant that lithium and chromium and nickel mining was going to be carried out on the lands of indigenous peoples in the same way that coal and oil and gas and uranium mining has taken place, that is not a transition for indigenous peoples and is certainly not just. Free prior informed consent is the internationally recognized standard for carrying out development projects on indigenous people's lands. And just to follow up on the minister from Colombia, this is not just historically and currently taking place in what is called developing countries. The whole southwest area of the United States was declared a national sacrifice zone where Pueblo and Dene and Ute indigenous peoples lived for uranium and coal mining starting back in the 1940s and 50s. And that is being carried out today with lithium mining in many areas, especially on sacred sites. So we came in, and I'm not sure how to start. I just have 2 slides I wanted to show. We came in with the hope to be able to talk about indigenous people's knowledge and practices for just transition. This is just an example, and I just got the statistic on this here that living soil is the 3rd greatest absorber of carbon. And that soil that has not been contaminated and killed by agribusiness with pesticides and chemical fertilizers. This is actually our family farm in Tucson, Arizona, in the Sonora Desert, using traditional seeds and sustainable well water for irrigation. Another example of just transition is the removal of invasive species. This is actually Hawaii, where a nation of Hawaii on their land removed the eucalyptus that had been planted there from Australia, and the water table came right up, and they're growing their traditional foods. Unfortunately, we're finding in the negotiations that these kind of discussions are very, very far from what's actually taking place here. I've heard countries in the negotiation sessions on just transition say that increased fossil fuel development is part of their national just transition plan. So we are finding ourselves fighting for the inclusion of rights of indigenous peoples in the negotiating text. It's actually in and out and bracketed and kind of a political football here. And we're waiting for the point that our knowledge and our rights are recognized so that we can begin to share the time-tested knowledge of indigenous peoples for a real just transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and I want to reiterate the concept of indigenous science, which we discussed also in the past. Like this, we also want to really see this more and more within the negotiations as well. In order to conclude the interventions from the panelists, I would like to move on to Dean. He will guide us through the African context as well. And Dean, we were talking before about some of the predominantly, like that in Africa, the just transition predominantly means a combination of 3 structural crises: debt, energy, and food. And I wanted to ask you, how do we see reflected this at the local level, and how do we integrate it into the international landscape?
Yep. Thank you. Apologies for my voice. I've had to talk quite a lot here at COP. We have to understand that decades after Africa's independence, we've got a development crisis, which has obviously been exacerbated by the climate emergency that's posing a threat to sustainable development. And underpinning both development and the climate emergency is the energy crisis. And a significant amount of this is something that is challenged through the root causes of colonialism that Africa has had to endure over the last 50 years. As a result of this, there are 3 structural deficiencies that Africa currently faces if we're talking about a just transition. One is food sovereignty, a lack of food sovereignty. The second is a lack of an energy sovereignty. And the third one is low value added content for exports relative to imports. This, in instances, also then triggered trade deficits, weakened African currencies, and also created an endless cycle of debt. This could easily be operationalized through giving various examples. So, for example, the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism program, for example, where the European Union is not allowed to receive carbon-intensive products into its market, right? Yet, that in its all has costed Africa about $25 billion in terms of carbon tax. Now, recently, they've only committed 2% to renewable energy, thus forcing us to continue to actually trade in carbon-intensive products, which is your steel, your cement, your aluminum, you name it, thus, again, entrapping us in a cycle that is further exacerbated by debt. But grounding that debt as well is we are now exporting in a currency that's not ours. There are no American dollars in Africa. There are no euros in Africa. There are no pounds in Africa. We trade in Kenyan shillings, in South African rands, in Zimbabwean dollars, in Zambian kwachas. Essentially meaning that in order for us to be competitive in the trade market, we have to maintain this artificial idea of how we operationalize and artificially maintain our exchange rate. Meaning that we've got an over 2 trillion deficit in Africa as a whole as a result of that structural trap. We can even talk about the droughts. Again, we bear the brunt of the climate justice issues caused by fossil fuels. The El Nino drought has increased food prices, and we're looking at the idea around a just transition in Africa. There's a growing inequality gap that is also exacerbated by a historical legacy that is then, again, fueled by capitalism, and we cannot afford the rising food prices. So there's this whole instance of these structural traps that really has caught Africa in this non-development state. Now, in order for us to actually make up for the structural deficits, we have to borrow more. Once we've borrowed more, again, we are exporting and importing again in our currency that's not our own, again, catching us in a cycle where we're actually trading and actually not meeting those trade deficits. Thus, again, we have to borrow more for the next cycle of the next value-added product across the African continent. Thus, we are caught in that structural deficit, which has not really added any gain for us. And as a result, the country has been blessed, or the continent has been blessed with 60% solar potential. 40% energy critical minerals sit in Africa for the decarbonization process. Yet very little has been invested in that. Thus, to a larger extent, we are caught in a historical energy system that has only produced 600 million people without energy access, 900 million without clean cooking alternatives. And there's been very little political will in order to do that. It goes beyond, again, also political will, but an acknowledgement of a responsibility to the global South and Africa of the climate crisis and the historical polluters that have actually exacerbated and given birth to that climate crisis. The debt cancellation becomes also important when looking at the just transition instance. I say this because sometimes it feels like when you talk about debt cancellation, something that's never happened before. When the world finally, found peace after World War II, Germany was in a crisis, their debt was forgiven. America borrowed 5% of its GDP to the German government. That is equivalent to the value right now currently in 2023 of $3 trillion. So it's been done before. But again, because of how we've been viewed as Africans and we don't have the ability to make our own decisions, that has not been afforded to us, yet we are in a crisis. And that is why I very much appreciate this panel, because we quite have to be very mindful about the just transition. It's not really about transitioning from one element to the other. It's why we are transitioning, why we feel the need to transition, and where we're going to, and how do we then also use that in a holistic manner where we have a people-centered approach and people's needs are met above the elite group of people who are really exploiting and catching Africans in a cycle of need, want, and fear. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you to all our panelists for bringing here your perspectives and these very tangible challenges that we need to tackle if we are to connect the local with the international. I would like to open the floor now again to questions from the audience, also to our audience online. If you can just send them in the chat, we will make sure to answer them today here. I have one question here in the back, so maybe let's start with that one. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Mark Workman. I'm with the World Blind Union. I just want to first thank the panel for the remarks, super interesting. The World Blind Union is an organization of persons with disabilities, and just by way of a very quick preamble, I'll note that people with disabilities face much higher rates of unemployment and underemployment compared to people without disabilities. And so I see the just transition as having a lot of opportunity for people with disabilities if we get it right, to change those inequities. If we get it wrong, however, I think we're just going to see a duplication of the existing inequalities that we see today. And I was really interested in the example from India of a very concrete kind of approach that could be taken to include social concerns within the tender process. And so my question is just whether others on the panel have ideas, solutions, recommendations for how we can start to address the inequalities that face people with disabilities, but also indigenous people in the employment sector, women, youth, immigrants. All of these groups are often underrepresented in employment and face barriers with respect to pay equity, etc. So really just interested in solutions or ideas or thoughts from anyone on the panel on how we can use this just transition to fix these existing inequalities.
Thank you very much for your question. Is there any other question at the moment? No? Okay, let's start with this one. Does anyone want to begin?
I could start. I think another example that I want to give is the need for small concessional loan products, finance, particularly to the kinds of groups that you mentioned. Thank you very much for your question. I think it is questions like this that force us to become very concrete, very tangible, and often there are actions that can be done fairly easily. It's just that nobody has paid special attention to them. So for example, in the state of Uttar Pradesh in the north, which is a relatively less advanced economy, there were loan products that were given for women self-help groups who want to set up electric three-wheeler rickshaws for shared public transport. And the rates, the interest rates at which these are given to these women are lower and sort of easier in terms of commercial bank loans that would be given for the fossil fuel-based, internal combustion-based transport. So I think that is the kind of action that needs to be built in terms of the financial institutions that can support this. And it's becoming extremely important in an economy like India because we have a massive addition to the job force, the workforce, but we don't have as many formal jobs. There's a great reliance on enterprise, on entrepreneurship to provide the kinds of livelihoods that are needed for the new entrants to the workforce. So financial incentives and customized loan products for groups which have historically been marginalized, vulnerable, need to be designed. There are also one more specific example I'll add, which is that often these groups lack the credit history to be able to access or the collateral to be able to access new financial products. And digital public infrastructure, namely digital payment infrastructure, is becoming really scaled up in India. In Africa as well, we've had the experience of M-Pesa and others. And this entire thing gives you a payment history that acts as a kind of credit history and collateral. So I think we need this entire sector to come in and start designing products which can actually boost these groups.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very important question you asked. Ghana hasn't started its just transitions in the context of climate change, but we have transitions happening in the various sectors. In the light of just transitions and climate change, I think that if one country starts or any other community starts or sector is starting a transition, it is very important it does an assessment, an analysis of it, subjecting it to tools and methodologies. That will then define the kind of employment that is available and it's not available, whether it's going to be substituted or whether it's going to be created or whether it's going to be lost, whether it has impact on the vulnerable sectors and vulnerable situations and vulnerable communities, whether which genders will be most affected and youth. So without subjecting it to tools and methodologies, and just creating assumptions, we'll be losing sight on a very critical population, the population of those in vulnerable situations, the vulnerability group, and then people with disability. So in short, this is what I'll say from my side. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question, actually. So if I may add on what was mentioned regarding the investment aspect and financial vehicles. So one of the criteria for the fund that was launched yesterday is to have a specific criteria in the proposals or in the terms of reference of people applying for the fund that includes marginalized communities, vulnerable people, especially in projects where we're refurbishing infrastructure to go towards a more green, sustainable economy. For example, transport sector. There are specific criteria that needs to be taken into consideration that need to be in each or every proposal that is being submitted to ensure that no one is left behind. I know that that's a sentence that's used very often, but you know, we're trying to make sure that all the marginalized communities, vulnerable communities in Lebanon are always taken into consideration when you're transitioning, whether it's the transport sector, energy sector, at the very local level, or even at a higher national policy level.
Thank you, Leah.
Thank you. The issue of employment is a complicated one for indigenous peoples because our main focus is always protecting our traditional lands and our traditional lifeways and livelihoods tied to those lands and waters that we have traditionally owned, occupied, used, or otherwise acquired in the language of the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And many times both unsustainable development and now the new, nature-based solution type development is presented to us as a way to have jobs to make up for the loss of our traditional lands and livelihoods, contamination of our waters, etc. So we're seeing that with this discussion of just transition, and that's why my question and the question of indigenous peoples is how do we define transition? What are we transitioning away from and to, and how do we define just? Certainly, the human rights of all members of the human family must be included in that. And by the way, today is the 75th anniversary of the signing of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that I just quoted. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Anyone else have a question for the panelists? Oh, please. Otherwise, I think, do we have... It's not working, but I think... No, we can have the other microphone for the people who are joining us online. Thank you.
The question is not directed to anyone in particular, but whoever feels to respond to this. I think your perspectives, they shed a lot of light in the local situations of transitions, and the question comes up, what is a transition, what to where? Also the issues connected to the transition of inequality and justice, etc. If you would address somebody internationally to work with you and to where do you see entry points of improvement there when you look at that international level? I think that would be something that, particularly in the context of climate change, where we are all in this together, it's almost absurd that there is so, let's say, few attempts to really work together. So where are your entry points for collaboration there with international actors?
Thank you for the question, Heiner. We have about 4 minutes, so I think probably this is going to be the closing question. I know some of our panelists need to run to negotiations, so just wanted to give you a sense of time, but if anyone wants to begin? Olga? Yes?
I could very briefly say it's very similar to the issue of adaptation. It's a local issue. It's subject to local realities and contexts. But it's also an issue which doesn't lend itself well to commercial investments, to profit making. So you can think of it almost as the just part of just transition will be about actions that are in the developmental sector that are very similar to adaptation actions. They will be in sectors which are very similar. So this is not something very new. It is not something that, no one has done before. And there is a great role for international organizations that are doing financing, that are doing skilling, that are doing social dialogue, and that are creating safe spaces, safe accommodation, safe transport for women, to bring in that expertise into the just transition domain. So I think there is first and foremost a need for finance, for actions that would not attract commercial private finance from developed to developing countries.
Thank you. I think a good starting point for all of us, including the previous question on persons with disabilities, has to be, in this dialogue, preambular paragraph 11 of the Paris Agreement, which calls on states to implement their human rights obligations to all of us, to a whole list of actors, including indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, gender, youth, etc. And that is actually in the Paris Agreement, and all decisions and actions are supposed to start with that point, is the human rights obligations of states. So I invite everybody to look at PP 11 of the Paris Agreement, and I will just note we were able to get that into the preamble of the decision here on just transition, the whole thing spelled out. So that's where we can start, and it brings us all together.
Thank you very much, Andrea.
Actually, I just wanted to add one more thing that you can look at from an international perspective, in addition to the financing, is that on just transition, not all the projects are the most bankable projects. And that's, I think, what was meant with that. It's very similar to adaptation, but there is an entry point from a development perspective. But again, to ensure that all people are included, human rights are taken into consideration. So it's an between adaptation projects and development projects. And that could be a very good entry point to work where international organizations can, provide financing for countries or financing strategies, mechanisms that can kind of be geared towards that. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to add there should be a strong government support. And as has been already said, dedicated funding, having strong, diverse coalitions, and then diversifying the economy, which would definitely lead to the transitions. But as I mentioned earlier, when you're doing a transition, what is a transition? Even in the negotiations, that's where we found a problem. Just tonight, some of us proposed the Paris Agreement, where it talks about not leaving anyone behind, getting all the vulnerable situations, the vulnerable groups, the disabilities, and all into it, and it was taken away as of just dawn. I proposed that. It's been taken away this dawn. I've not had the opportunity to sit in that session to actually counter my case. But then, as I mentioned earlier on, when a transition is being done, if you do not assess and analyze the situation, you leave people behind. It is not as simple as that. It is so complex and should have some dedication to it, and it should have a government support. If there's a government support, then there will be coherence. There will be social dialogue. There will be participation from all sectors. And that would then define what kind of transition. I liked what my colleague mentioned. What are we transitioning from to? Is it our nickels or our cobalt or our lithiums? Then it means that we are going to leave a hole in the ground and then exporting it somewhere else. How do we benefit that transition? Especially when there are unilateral measures in that aspect. So these are certain questions that I will leave, because the measures or policies that is defining our transition may not go well for developing countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angelina. We are now out of time. Dean, would you like to make a final comment?
Okay, sure. I think for me, it's the just transition is not a one-size-fits-all. It's quite different for different contexts. To answer your question, in the African context, for me, local ownership is such a huge thing. structural adjustment programs are such a huge thing. We don't own our food systems, we don't own our energy systems, we don't own any industries, particularly those are owned by the global West, essentially, right? Adaptation plays a clue role, and I really want to push the idea around the new global financial architecture reform, in the sense that when Africa attained its independence, we needed a lot of money to actually fund that independence. We got into a lot of deals that were not meant to get into. The structural adjustment programs and the Bretton Woods system was actually done during a period when there were no African countries independent. There was a lot of colonialism and racism during that time and segregation. So the big question is, why are we speaking about the just transition using a framework that defines economic activity that was created in a time that was perpetuating inequality and colonialism? And that's a big underlying issue we need to tackle if we are to actually achieve that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dean. I think we are out of time today, but it has been a really fascinating discussion, and I have learned a lot from all of you here on the table and the previous speakers as well. The key takeaway for me, because we have talked about a lot of topics, including the role of science, the importance of understanding what are we facing out and in from, transitioning in and out of as well, the role of finance, how to include other groups like peoples with disabilities, a structural crisis that we need to navigate through, and so many others. But the key takeaway is that we have basically a long road ahead, and we need to also take into consideration that if we delay action, we may end up in a situation where we actually have even more complex transition challenges to deal with. So I think we all agree that we need to really seize this opportunity to use the work program on just transitions to catalyze this transformational change that we need. And I hope that the conversations we had here today will re-energize you to keep momentum for increased ambition on just transitions during the final days of COP. I would like to thank again all of our panelists for sharing their knowledge, their stories, their experiences. It has been a pleasure having you all here. And thank you also to the Republic of Colombia and DIW Berlin for being co-hosts of this event today. For all of you who join us today as well, and those online, thank you for being with us and for staying until the end of the event. Thank you. Yes, the panelists, if you can join me on stage for a final picture, that would be appreciated. Everyone else, thank you.